Hello and welcome to Brokenomics, and in this episode I'm going to be covering the business cycle, where I tie together lessons from previous Brokenomics series and put the whole thing together so that we can explain the whole economy and the whole business cycle in one go. There's only going to be one book on the reading list for this week, and that is Ray Dalio's Principles, and it is largely from that book that I've drawn the summary of these lessons, so that will be down in the reading lists. So, the economic cycle, the whole economy, is actually a fairly simple mechanism when you start to break it down. It can look very complicated when you first start to look at it, in the same way that perhaps an internal combustion engine in your car might look very complicated at first glance. But once you understand a handful of core principles that puts it all together, then the whole thing becomes quite straightforward. And by the end of this episode, I want to get you to the point where you understand the economy and the business cycle better than perhaps the average politician and journalist, certainly, and possibly even better than the average chancellor, especially if they're a Labour chancellor. I suppose it makes not much difference these days. So let's do that with the economy. First thing you need to break down is the broad mechanisms which the whole business cycle fits into. They are productivity growth. That's a long-term effect. The short-term debt cycle, which plays out over 5 to 10 years, and the long-term debt cycle, which is much closer to something like maybe 70 to 100 years. Combine all of those together and you get the economic machine as a whole. You understand the whole boom and bust dynamic. So, first of all, let's cover the productivity growth. That's quite simply how we are finding better, cheaper, faster ways of doing things and getting the results that we want. It is the natural progression of learning from our mistakes from technological process. Historically, this has tended to be something like 2 or 3% every year for many, many years. I mean, going back centuries, this has applied. Potentially, it can start to pick up in the digital age, but ultimately that is the sort of level of increase that we've been seeing over the long term. And these productivity growth, they can make an enormous difference when you look at it on a long-term perspective. It's why we're able to get significantly more, say, food out of significantly less land today. There was a time when all of us would have been subsistence farmers, whereas now only a small percentage of the population are engaged in that kind of work. So it's pretty stable, goes up by a few percent a year. We can park that for now, and let's start to dig into the other end of the scale, so the smallest time scale. And for that, I'm going to look at individual transactions. So individual transaction, it's very simple. You get a buyer and a seller together, and they exchange for goods or services. And they settle that in either money or credit. You add up the total amount of money and credit together, and you get the total amount of spending. You add up the total amount of goods and services sold, you divide one by the other, and you get the price. So, pretty simple. You add that up, you get into the economy. Now, the way we look at that is through markets. So, different types of transactions are grouped into markets. Everybody who's doing a particular type of transaction, we just basically lump into a market. And it's various markets. It can be the market for pints or haircuts, or the gas market, or even the labour market. Millions of other markets, each made up in turn of millions of transactions. You add up those different markets, and that's it. You've got the economy. It's super simple, and everybody's involved in this at some stage or another. The biggest player in the economy is going to be the government. They are the biggest buyer and the biggest seller in it. The government is made up of two parts. It's the central government, and it's the central bank. Now, the central bank are selling something, just like the rest of us. What they're selling is that the transaction is slightly different here. It's called taxes. And if you buy what they're selling, they in turn don't come and take you away and throw you in prison for the rest of your life. So they're essentially selling freedom. And they are spending their money on the other side on things that benefits them. So they're spending money on the military, so another foreign government cannot come and take them over. They spend things on state protection, such as police and courts, so that any dissidents who question them can be dealt with and placed in jail, and also genuine criminals as well. They spend money on healthcare, so that if the taxpayers become sick, they can be patched up so they can go out and continue to work again. They pay out money on welfare, so that people who are completely dysfunctional and don't want to engage, they can be given a way of staying alive effectively, getting some income in, and also those people can be relied upon to vote the right way, which again helps government. They spend money on pensions so that the workers are no longer having to stay home to look after elderly parents. That can instead be shifted on to pensions so that workers can get out there and pay more taxes, and roads so that the workers can get from place to place. So that's essentially the government in a nutshell. And then the other half of it, central banks. Central banks are a little bit different, because what they do is they control the total amount of money and credit in the system. They influence it very heavily. And they do that through two mechanisms. The first is printing money, so thus giving us the root of inflation, which we talked about in episode 2, the inflation episode. And they do it through interest rates that we talked about in episode 3, when we talked about interest rates and the way that they manipulate those. And this makes the central bank the big gorilla in the credit market. Now, the credit market is an important one to understand. You are already going to understand the economy, having followed so far. But if you understand the credit market as well as the economy, then we can get to the business cycle. So this market is super important. It's big and it's volatile. And it still has regular transactions. And we use a slightly different terminology here. Instead of buyers and sellers, we call them lenders and borrowers, but it's ultimately the same dynamic is happening here. Lenders have an excess of production. They have too much money, and so they want to push that into the future by lending it to somebody with the hope they are going to get more money back in the future. So it's going to come back with interest. And borrowers are doing the other thing. They are wanting to increase their spending now at the expense of the future. So they are wanting to pull money out of their future and bring it to their present, because they want to buy something that they can't currently afford. It could be a business or it could be a home. So the borrower agrees to pay back this money that he's getting, plus an interest on top. And the interest rate is really the key factor here, as we explored in the interest rates video back in Brokenomics 3. The higher the interest rate, of course, the more money you're going to need to pay back in the future. And it does make a big difference. So to give you an example, let's say you are borrowing this money, you're borrowing £300,000 to buy a house, and you're going to pay an interest rate of 3% on that. In addition to repaying the original capital, you're going to pay at 3%, 130 grand on top at 3%. But if you take that interest rate up to 6%, then you're now going to pay 280 grand on top of your 300 grand for that mortgage over 25 years. So the interest rate that you're borrowing at does make a significant difference. So obviously, as the interest rate increases, there are fewer and fewer people who wish to take out a loan. Now, as we've talked about in the earlier episodes as well, when a loan is taken out, effectively what happens is credit gets created out of thin air. The borrower now has more money, so he can increase his spending. And that drives the economy. Why does that drive the economy? Well, because my spending is somebody else's income. Because of the dynamic that there is for every transaction, there's two sides to it. If somebody is spending more, somebody else is earning more. So you get into the dynamic where more borrowing goes into an economy, more debt, more credit. That increases spending, which increases somebody else's income, which allows them to go out and spend or borrow more, and the cycle continues. And you get that debt expansionary growth effect. Now, if you understand this dynamic, you're going to understand why we have cycles. Because when we acquire debt, we can spend more than we earn. So you can think about it, this is a lifetime, borrowing, spending more than I earn, and then I'm borrowing less, and then I'm repaying it. So you sort of get into that cycle. And that applies at the macro level as well. You combine a sufficient number of people, you apply the same general macro conditions to them, and you're going to get people clustering and doing that basically in aggregate. So the debt market is basically just the adding up of all of the individuals making that, and then you compare that against the productivity line. And that is effectively the short-term debt cycle. It lasts something like 5 to 10 years, something of that order, excess borrowing, and then paying back on the other side. So you get that, what Gordon Brown called the boom and bust swing. Now, in a world without credit, there would be significantly less of this effect, significantly less of cycles. I mean, there might still be the human behavior element of it that goes into this as well that helps emphasize it, but this would be significantly reduced. You'd only be able to spend what you earned. Now, actually, credit can be a good thing. I'm not opposed to credit, and it can be very good if you align it with your productive energy. If you can align your productive energy with your capital, that works. So, I mean, let me give you an example. Back when I was in VC, one of the firms that came to see me was the management team of a family business. The family business was in confectionery. And I think this was a third generation business. And the guy who now owned it, the owner was not managing it. The owner was out of the picture. He was basically just receiving the income from the business while his management team did the running of the business. He was an older guy and he wasn't very dynamic. He had no interest in taking risks or doing anything different with the business. So the management team were coming to him and saying, we could do this, we could expand into this market, we could change this product line, we could do that kind of thing. And he was just like, no, not interested. But what I would be interested in is if you wanted to buy it off me and then you can do whatever you like with it. So you've then got a management team who've got all this productive energy, but they don't own the business. So what they did is they came to venture capitalists like me to raise the money, and they also went out and took some credit alongside it so that they could then acquire that business and they could apply themselves to it and they could achieve they were investing effectively. They could then do more with that business going forward. In that environment, credit is perfectly fine. Give you another example. Let's say a young guy in his say late teens or early 20s. He's just come out of agricultural college or however it is it's done in farming, and he wants to go out and he wants to buy a farm and some basic farming equipment. He doesn't have any capital to do that at his young age, but he's got a lot of productive energy. It is perfectly reasonable for him to want to use credit to achieve the outcome of getting startup to launch his farm or whatever the business is that he wants to do. So if you're using it to invest, credit is a perfectly sensible thing to do. The problem we've got into, as we've discussed many times on this series, is that increasingly people are using credit not for investment, but they're using it for consumption. And this is especially the case for governments. Governments are doing very little investment with the borrowing, but they are taking out the vast amount of borrowing. I think the UK is currently borrowing something like $250 billion a year. They're borrowing about 250 billion a year at the moment. That's not going on investment on new power stations and new roads and new digital infrastructure. That's going to keep the lights on at the local school and the local hospital. It is pure consumption.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.